Wednesday, Israel celebrated 75 years of statehood with flyovers, flags, and messages from powerful friends. But the joyous celebrations on a momentous anniversary masked a deep division in that nation. Indeed, Israel's President Isaac Herzog said a week ago that the greatest existential threat to Israelis comes from within, from polarization and alienation. The biggest issue dividing the nation is a plan by the Netanyahu government to overhaul the judiciary and weaken it significantly in the process. That plan is on hold, at least for the moment. But the division has not disappeared. Joining me now is Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Welcome, Prime Minister.
Thank you. Good to be with you, Fareed.
Prime Minister, you have been Prime Minister many, many years, many times. You have never brought up these kind of judicial changes before. Your critics say that the reason you're bringing them up is that you need the support of a couple of minority parties, tiny parties. Is it worth the stability of the nation, the constitutional framework of the nation being altered so much just to placate these really two tiny parties?
I think that's completely not only wrong, but also misinformed. There is a very broad segment of the Israeli public, 2.5 million people, the majority who voted for me and my government, who are eager to see a restoration of the balance between the three branches of government. In Israel, all democracies are based on the balance between the will of the majority and the rights of the minority, individual rights. That balance is assured by the balance between the three branches of government, the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. In Israel, over the last 20 years, the judiciary has become increasingly powerful and has dominated both, actually overriding decisions by the democratically elected legislature and executive. So people want to bring it back in line. On the other side, and hundreds of thousands of people showed up in a demonstration a day after Independence Day, hundreds of thousands who are supporting this reform. On the other side are people who are saying, well, if you tilt the pendulum to the other side and have the legislator have overriding, unrestricted overriding power over the Supreme Court, you will impinge on his individual rights. So there has to be a happy middle here. And what I decided to do about a month ago is to, press the pause button and allow for an attempt to reach a consensus on something that I think is important for Israeli democracy. But one thing I guarantee you, at the end of this process, Israel that was a democracy, is a democracy, will remain as robust a democracy. And you can see that by the fact that hundreds of thousands of people are demonstrating for or against this judicial reform in peaceful demonstrations in ways that are not possible within an enormous radius. And when you have that, as you have in France, or protests in France, or protests in the United States, it's not a sign of the collapse of democracy. It's a sign of the robustness of the public debate, which I'm sure, and I hope, and I'm working to resolve by as broad a consensus as I can.
But Prime Minister, the issue is not a democracy. It is what kind of democracy Israel will have. Will it have a kind of liberal democracy or an illiberal democracy? And you talked about three branches of government, but in Israel, you have a parliamentary democracy, so the executive branch and the legislative branch are fused. You control both. You don't have a constitution. You don't have an upper house of parliament. You have no Senate. You don't have state governments. So when you look at the American system, there are all those checks and balances. The Supreme Court is the only check on an elected government in Israel, and that is why so many constitutional scholars around, both in Israel, the United States, diehard supporters like Alan Dershowitz are all opposed to this plan. Are you willing to compromise and withdraw those elements of the proposal?
Well, first of all, Alan Dershowitz has said that if Israel actually went with the original proposal as proposed by the Justice Minister, it wouldn't be an illiberal democracy. He said it would resemble New Zealand, Canada, and the United States. So understand that there's a lot of hype and a lot of exaggeration. But I'll tell you one thing that I've already said, and I think people now understand it and accept it, on my side of the spectrum, that we cannot move the pendulum from one side of the most activist judicial branch on the planet that arrogates the will of the majority and, again, overriding the decisions of the elected government, to the other side, where you'd have the parliament essentially overriding with a simple majority the will of the decisions of the Supreme Court. Israel has been thrown off balance. The big challenge, it's a big one, is to bring it back to a balance that is accepted in most democracies between the three branches of government, without going to a side that would indeed remove checks and balances on the power of the majority. I have no problem with that. As you know, I was educated in the United States. I am fully conversant with the Federalist Papers. I actually read them more than once. And I think that what we are trying to do is put this system into balance. And by the way, in most parliamentary democracies, the executive and the legislative are mixed. So you really have two poles. And if it's swung to one side, bring it back to the center. Don't swing it to the other side. And I'm going to ensure that that's not going to happen. By the way, most of the supporters of judicial reform that are now encompassing the vast majority of the public, not the details, but the need for judicial reform, agree that it should be somewhere in the middle, which is always a hard task. You know, it's hard to achieve that balance, but that's what democracies are about. You argue, you fight verbally, you negotiate, and hopefully you find a consensus.
Do you worry that some of the most prominent Israeli citizens, people who are at the heart of the tech industry, the heart of startup nation, are saying that they would actually move their companies and move themselves if the changes go ahead?
Truthfully, no. I'm not worried, because Israel is a fount of technology, is a fount of innovation. Some of them who said they'd move the money out lost the money. I don't know if they put it in the Silicon Valley Bank, but Israel is a safe place. It's got I think we're very proud of the fact that we've built here a real robust and responsible free market economy. And because Israel's, the worry that I think was reflected in the beginning and is hyped up as though the independence of the judiciary will anyway be compromised, that's false. It's not going to happen. There's a difference between an independent judiciary, which Israel must always have, and an all-powerful judiciary. And I think that people are beginning to recognize, when I look at what is happening, they recognize that Israel's future economically, including in the high-tech sector, is going to be secure.
Next on GPS, will Israel's burgeoning peace with its Arab neighbors be hurt by this month's breakout of new violence between the Israelis and the Palestinians? I asked the Prime Minister about that when we come back. Israeli forces stormed one of Islam's holiest sites, the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. The raid came during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan. Israeli police said they took the action after, quote, hundreds of rioters and mosque desecrators barricaded themselves, unquote, inside. The raids prompted a major uptick in violence, including rocket fire from Lebanon, Gaza, and Syria, and Israeli airstrikes in response. Back now with more of my interview earlier today with Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Prime Minister, when we last talked, before you were Prime Minister just a few months ago, you had hinted that you thought there was going to be some movement on relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel. You, of course, managed to normalize relations with the United Arab Emirates, with Bahrain. But we are hearing reports here that the Saudis, the Emiratis, are all concerned about the rising level of violence between Israeli government and Palestinians. Is that going to put a freeze on your plans, which were, I think, to normalize relations with Saudi Arabia?
Well, first, we're doing everything to make sure that the forces that are basically financed and equipped and pushed by Iran that are trying to foment this violence around our borders and within our borders do not succeed. But what we hear from our Arab neighbors, of course, is something else. I think they have no illusions about the danger of Iran and Iran-sponsored terrorism and aggression in the region. And they also have no illusion about the fact that Israel is a force for stability, for peace, and for security. And that's why the relations are actually, well, they're improving. We just signed a free trade agreement with the UAE. We've just expanded the semi-normalization, well, the baby steps normalization that we've had with Saudi Arabia. You know, we've been flying over Saudi airspace, hundreds of thousands of Israelis. Actually, that began 2 years before the historic Abraham Accords. That was done with, obviously, with Saudi acquiescence, to say the least. Now, recently, under my government, we opened up the route to fly to India and Asia through Oman, again, going through Saudi airspace. So I think that there is, I'm very hopeful, and I believe this is not pie in the sky, that we will actually expand the historic Abraham Accords in a quantum leap, because I think that peace with Saudi Arabia, normalization with Saudi Arabia, is in the interest of peace in the Middle East, is in the interest of both our countries, and I think it's possible. When I spoke about the Abraham Accords, and you may remember this because we've been talking to each other many years, but when I spoke about it, a lot of people poo-pooed it. They didn't think it was possible. And they said, they raised the Palestinian issue, and they raised other issues, and I said, no, it's not only possible, it's going to happen. And people had a problem seeing the impossible turn into the inevitable. Well, I'm saying now that peace with the major Arab countries is not only possible, I think it's likely, and I'm doing everything I can, not everything above surface, to advance it, because I think it'll change history. It'll be a pivot of history. It'll end the Arab-Israeli conflict and will advance the solution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Let me ask you about your relations with another ally. President Biden has publicly criticized the proposals that your government is making for judicial changes. He pointedly said he was not going to have you at the White House at a point where it seemed as though he was going to. What is the state of your relations with Joe Biden?
Well, he's been a friend of Israel and a friend of mine for 40 years. Doesn't mean we don't have our occasional disagreements. We've spoken on the phone several times, including a few weeks ago. The main figures in his security administration, the Secretary of Defense, the National Security Advisor, Secretary Blinken, have all been here. And we've had important conversations about our common concern with Iran's quest for nuclear weapons. I think the alliance between the United States and Israel is strong. It has strong bipartisan support. You know, the two leaders of the Senate, Chuck Schumer, Majority Leader, and Mitch McConnell, Minority Leader, were here within a few days. A few days later, we had Hakeem Jeffries, the Minority Democratic Leader in the House. And tomorrow, we're going to have Kevin McCarthy, the Majority Speaker in the House. I don't know of many countries that have, within a few days, the leaders, the Democratic and Republican leaders of both sides of the aisle, coming to Jerusalem, and I think that, and supporting Israel, and 400 and more congressmen, congresswomen, signed a resolution strongly supporting the Jewish state on its 75th anniversary. So I'm confident about the strength of our alliance. Yes, President Biden did say that he had hoped we'd have a consensus, seeking a consensus here on judicial reform. It's an internal matter, but I happen to agree with him, and that's what we're trying to do right now.
Next on GPS, next week will mark 5 years since President Trump announced he was unilaterally pulling the United States out of the Iran deal. Is Israel safer or more vulnerable because of that? Right back with Bibi Netanyahu. Military officer, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, warned last month that Iran had the capability to produce enough fissile material for a nuclear weapon in less than 2 weeks. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has often warned that a nuclear Iran poses an existential threat to Israel. Here's more of my interview with him. Prime Minister, you very famously opposed the Iran nuclear deal. When it was put in place, the IAEA and almost all intelligence agencies I know have said Iran was more than a year away from having the fissile material to produce a bomb. Now with the Iran agreement abrogated, Iran is, by most intelligence agencies' accounts, 2 weeks away from having the fissile material to produce a bomb. Isn't that prima facie evidence that your opposition to the Iran deal was misguided, that it was keeping Iran much further away from nuclear weapon status than it is currently?
According to our estimates, Fareed, the efforts that we made, which are manifold, some in the operational side, some in the economic and political side, have made Iran basically lagged behind its original plans. They thought they'd be where they are now about 10 years ago. But we were able to slow them down, but not able to stop them completely. To complete a weapon, they have to make a decision to cross the line into 90% enrichment. And the second thing they need is a weapon, the bomb itself, which is different from the fissile material at the core of the bomb. And the third thing they need are missiles. The deal that is being discussed would have paved their way with gold to achieving all three, because it doesn't stop the development of the missiles, it doesn't stop the development of the weapons, it doesn't even address these two things, and it does enable them to continue developing the centrifuges that would have brought them to a point where in 2 years, in 1 year, they'd have the approved ability, approved by the international community, to enrich uranium at an unlimited rate. What this means is this: if you want to stop Iran from becoming a nuclear power, the only way, a military nuclear power, the only way that you can stop them is with a credible military threat. This is what worked against Saddam Hussein's nuclear weapon program in Iraq. That was done by us. This is what worked against Bashar al-Assad's nuclear military plans in Syria. That was done by us. This is what worked against Gaddafi's Libya's military nuclear plan. It was stopped by a credible military threat on your part. It didn't work in the case of North Korea, and now they have a nuclear arsenal which threatens half of Asia and perhaps the west coast of the United States, and perhaps soon all of the United States. Iran has been slowed down because of a credible military threat, and I can tell you that it hasn't been stopped, I grant you that, but we have a job to do. The jury's still out on all of us to prevent Iran from having nuclear weapons, because if it does, all the Middle East will go nuclear, and I think that we cannot assure that Iran will act as a nuclear power with this Islamist, I would call it theological thuggery that controls it. We don't know that they will act in a rational way, and this could change history in a negative way. I think the onus is on all of us, Israel, the United States, the free world, and many of our Arab neighbors, to do everything in our power to prevent Iran from becoming a military nuclear power, and this is certainly something I'm committed to, and in many ways this is why I came back and was reelected. You know, there have to be other reasons to join the rosy path of Israeli politics. This is the most important one.
Prime Minister, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very much. I hope we can continue this conversation soon.
I hope so too. Thank you.
Next on GPS, lessons on COVID. What did America learn from more than 1 million deaths in this country? When we come back.